So my fireside chat this week is with Chloe, who is a good friend of mine. We've known each other a long time. She has a brand new baby. Things are wonderful in her world. And we're going to talk about how she got into behavioral science. So how are you?
I am good, thank you. Just as I was telling you earlier, it's my nanny's third day. So I'm a new mum as of a year ago and just returning back to work, but feeling pretty good.
Feeling pretty good and pretty sorry about it. If the baby cries, just go and I will tap dance and people will laugh at
Excellent,
me.
excellent.
I'm hilarious. Baby crying is much more important than talking to my wallet. So you're a fellow psych person at the end of at the beginning. And you and I are of an age, right? I think we both graduated in sort of 2004, 2005-ish.
Yeah, yeah.
Right-ish.
Similar vintage.
Similar vintage. Did you know, like, when did you know psych? Like, were you one of these kids who are like, I'm 6 and I know I'm going to be in psych, or did it come a little later for you?
It came a bit later. So I had my uncle, he is a research psychologist. So I kind of knew psychology through what he would do. And he was sort of a classic, tell me your feelings. Tell me, why do you think that? And I was like, I feel uncomfortable. I don't know. But I was aware of psychology. And then I didn't really discover it until I went to uni. I was going to be a marine biologist or an artist.
I was going to be a biologist too. Yeah,
Yeah.
this is
So,
this is where applied behavioral scientists start. But it's not. In some
yeah,
ways, it's not shocking. Biology is
it's
a behavioral science.
it's a science, and I'm super fascinated in like especially creatures of the ocean. I was like, look what they do. Why do they do that? And I quite like being in a lab, and I like research, and I like experiments. My dad's a chemical engineer, so I grew up with chemical experiments happening in our garage. So I was very comfortable with kind of more that, what you think of when you think of a scientist. So
And so wait, so you're off at you went to Victoria, right?
I went to Victoria Uni in Wellington. I enrolled in a science degree and I started studying biology and loved it. I did psychology out of interest. It was like you could take like 2 elective papers. And so I did psychology and I did a study on the Antarctic, which was geology. Um, I loved my psychology paper. Like, this is fascinating. And I enjoyed biology, but I remember it was like a Friday night and I was sitting in the lab. All my friends were out partying as they are when you're a uni student. And I was alone in the dark lab on like the 6th floor of the uni building. And I just imagined my future being in a lab alone. And I was like, I can't do this. I'm a people person. So I quit pretty much the next week and enrolled, kind of switched. And it was luckily psychology was still a science, still under science. So I could just cross credit and then move full time into psychology. So,
So you're like sitting in a lab pipetting, going like, "This cannot be my life."
this is not my life.
And was this like
And I
early?
think I wanted to talk to all the people in the lab, and they were not necessarily extroverted folks who wanted to talk back to me.
I have
So,
visions of young Chloe, like sort of, trying to engage the. I love this.
how's your petri dish going? Nothing.
Nothing. Was this like freshman year, or you got fairly far in, or
No, I was only in my first year. Is that freshman year in the States? So
yeah,
your first year of uni?
got it. So
Yeah.
you
So
so it
I
was pretty early.
pretty early. First, I did 1 year of biology, and then I switched to psychology by my second year. So I was pretty close, but did clinical psych. So I was studying clinical
Hmm.
psychology, and I thought that's what I wanted to do. And similar thing, got sort of 2 or 3 years in, and I was like, I don't know about this.
What made you have that? What do you remember? What made you have that moment?
I think it was thinking about, well, chatting to someone that they do these career guidance, and they had someone who came along and spoke about their day, and they said, and it was abnormal psychology and criminal psychology. And so I found learning about it super fascinating. And then I tried to imagine my future self having these really intense conversations every day. And I'm quite a light-hearted, pretty easygoing person. And I get really upset when there's things not going well in people's lives. I think most people do, but I was like, I can't do this. I'm just not. There has to be, and positive psychology wasn't necessarily a thing yet. So it was all very much the defective model. You're broken until you're fixed type of approach. But I was so far in psychology, I didn't really know what to do. So I enjoyed neuroscience. I started doing more neuroscience. I thought, oh, at least I can figure out how the brain works. That's pretty interesting. And that's kind of biology. And then I picked up a
And I
business
don't have to
degree.
hear about anybody's bad day in neuroscience.
Exactly. I can just kind of almost be in a lab, but it's kind of people related. And then I thought, oh, well, HR seems like something that I might like. So why don't I do a business degree? So then I changed again and picked up a business degree, and started studying management and HR.
And
So
faculty was super receptive and supportive. Faculty was going, why are you abandoning biology and clinical psychology? Where are your mentors and your teachers in this?
yeah, it was interesting. The business school was great. They said you have to get to do what you want to do. You need to work really hard for a semester and show us that your grades are good enough to do a co-joint. Um, I worked really hard and I had managed to keep pretty good grades along that. And I had a pretty good mentor in the cognitive psych team, and then one I found at the business school. And so she was starting to do something in the org psych space, but it wasn't a field yet. And I sort of spoke to her, I said, I really like psychology, but I feel like I want to work with people I want to work on motivation, and I want to work on kind of changing behaviors, and I want to work on people, helping them to enjoy their work, but I haven't found what that is. And she was like, stick with this, it'll come. And I was like,
We'll
okay,
make it happen. And
we'll make it happen.
had the two of them collaborated with students together before, or you were with a sort of trailblazer of this business?
It wasn't super common what I was doing. And I actually got to the end of my degree and I didn't really have another place to go. There wasn't an org psych program at the university. So I just go, okay, I guess I'll leave university and I'll wait, because I wanted to study more.
Mm-hmm.
And so I left and went into, well, I can talk about first jobs, but I did, a variety of jobs. And I went back to university 6 years later with Diane Gardner, who was the mentor early on and at a different university, and studied the org psych program. So I had to wait, I think it was 5 or 6 years, and then it was set up.
Got to do it again. What did you do? So what about the years between sort of Victoria and Massey, right? So you graduate undergrad, you've got this interesting interdisciplinary
combination of science and business and HR.
At a time when there wasn't necessarily an obvious place. Now I think we had Pete Judo on here recently, and I was talking with him about when he came out of school, there were, these were real things. When you and I came out of school, people were like, what's wrong with you?
What is this thing? And people would say to me, why are you studying those two things? Like, science and business. They were like, I don't understand. You need to choose.
Right.
And I was like, I was like, no, there's a way, I'll make it work. So I went and worked, actually, it's pretty aligned, actually. It was helping people who are unemployed find work. So it was a little bit, had elements of clinical psych in there, when you were dealing with people who are perhaps not at the best stages of their life, unemployed, and, perhaps not having huge amounts of confidence, but helping them set goals, helping them understand what they're motivated in the workplace. And I liked that, but it felt I was sitting with people every day, reliving that moment of those like deep conversations. I did that for a year, and then I discovered psychometrics. And I had a company in Brisbane sort of reach out to me and say, would you want to come be our test admin person? And so I worked with a company called Channel Cloud in Australia, which is, they at that stage were hiring IO psychs because Australia was a little more ahead on the university program. And I didn't know what an IO psych was. I worked underneath a guru psychologist. He was pretty close to retirement. Great rule breaker, because he let me do so many, taught me so many things. And he was like, you technically should have a master's for this, but I'm just going to let you go ahead and do this and learn how to do this. So I got great exposure to psychometric testing and what you're supposed to do. And at that point I was like, right, this is what I'm going to do. And so I quit, of course, and went traveling around the world for 14 months, as you do when you find your kind of thing you want to do. I was like, great, I'm going to go and switch off and explore the world. So I did that for 14 months. I did lots of random jobs. Like I was working as a cook in Alaska. I was a lifeguard in the States. I volunteered in Thailand. A bunch of fun things. And then I think I was in China and I got cold and I was lying on the grass in a park and I was like, I think it's time to go home. So
I think I'm ready.
Enrolled in the master's class, tracked down some mentors, and then was my second round of uni. And one of the things I had learned when I went into consulting, while I had a great guru psychologist who pretty much kind of let me do what I want, and I'd wear jandals, or do you call them flip-flops, like those kind of beach shoes?
Sandals, yeah.
Jandals, I would wear them to work meetings, and then I would quickly, I'd wear like, a suit that you had to wear. I'd wear my jandals and I'd quickly switch into my like heels or whatever I needed. I hated wearing suits, like hated it so much. And that was part of my reason of going around the world. I was like, okay, I love the work. I don't like the uniform. Let me go spend a year and a bit in yoga pants, and then I will be ready to wear a suit.
Let me get this. And this was still fairly one-on-one sort of psychometric testing, or are you doing more programmatic psychometric
We
testing?
did a little bit of programmatic stuff. It was more one-on-one. So we did a little bit of the government where we put through, some of it was you'd do testing of like 50 to 100 people in like group online settings with just coming in. But it was still, you'd bring people into these large testing centers. But most of the stuff was one or two candidates at a time. And then you do debriefs, one-on-one debriefs with both the candidate and then the client. So yeah, I was working a lot with HR teams, debriefing on, potential hires or development opportunities.
Well, and getting a lot of, that sort of coach. One of the things that we've heard over the, course of the firesides is, that sort of, a lot of people get some one-on-one coaching experience somewhere in there, right?
That's pretty much where I started doing having coaching as one of the things you do. It just sort of happened. And I actually started earlier when I was doing the career guidance.
Right.
That was essentially coaching, helping people set goals, helping them like understand what's important, helping them work through their limitations and their obstacles that they might face, and then giving them like a plan. And in that case, it was literally a reason to get out of bed, which became easier later on because you're normally dealing with quite motivated people. But it was good practice.
That's amazing. And so then you travel the world, and then you come back, and IO Psych feels natural, feels like this is the right place to go. Like, where does that sort of enter for you?
Yeah, definitely. I went back to uni, went back to Massey, studied IO Psych. I felt like I was with my people. I felt like really good. It was an applied, I didn't know the difference between like your more applied kind of courses and your more theoretical courses. This was specifically labeled an applied master's. In terms of the way they taught the course, they had practitioners who worked in businesses teaching the masters rather than research, like academics or researchers. Both obviously are valuable, but this was slightly more weighted towards the applied. And I was like, this is great. This is what it actually looks like in a business. And they would and most of it was case studies and ethics. And I was like, this is great. So I really loved it. And I felt like, okay, this is HR wasn't quite right for me. I had a couple of stints. I think at the time, HR was pretty limited to very rule-bound structure, set policies in place, not my strong point. I was like a scientist wanting to test everything and break things and be like, I think we should do it this way. Why don't we test this? And it was like, compliance, you can't test that. We need evidence that it works. And I'm like, this is how we get evidence that it works.
This is tautological, sir.
I know. It was like, and I remember getting doing a lot of like the psychometric testing. You do your licenses and you get profiled in a room of, and it was HR people, and I was profiled in a room of like 20 HR people, and they were calling out, they were doing the stories to tell you, like, to bring to light the characteristics. And one of the characteristics of the assessment was someone who comes up with, it was like artistic, comes up with wild ideas and is often seen as like a little bit odd in the workplace. I scored like in the 99th percentile on that trait. And I was the only one in the room. And I was sitting there going, oh, okay.
Yeah.
So
I think we hear that a lot. There is a little bit of an island of misfit toys version of applied behavioral science, particularly, the generation thing I think comes in,
yeah.
people who were there at those early days, that sort of like, let's call it 2000 to 2000 sort of 10-ish period, right?
Yeah.
Who graduated in 4, 5, 6, like, there's a little bit of a sense that you have to be a little bit odd because this is, you're doing a thing that nobody else is doing. And so everybody else is kind of looking at you going, well, that's weird.
What it is weird. Yes. I was like the strange person.
That's so the IO folks felt familiar to you, right?
It felt more familiar. It felt more enjoyable. It felt more natural to me, I guess, in terms of like this, at least through the lens of psychology. I felt like IO Psych was the psychology for me. If I kind of put the life psychology lens or limit on it, IO Psych felt right, and I enjoyed psychometrics. I did a bit more consulting. I still hated wearing suits. So I realized that consulting and suits just wasn't for me. So I did another round of quitting and going home and surfing and writing a dissertation. And I was like, right, back to the yoga pants. What can I do? And then for my next role, I thought, well, ironically, I'd studied workplace values in my master's, and how it should influence your choices. And I hadn't applied it to myself. I had just said, I don't like wearing suits. My criteria for my next job is that I can wear jeans to the interview. I kid you not, that was it.
This is it. I don't care.
I
As long
don't
as it's
care.
sort of vaguely IO related and I
As
can.
long as it's like vaguely IO related. So I actually joined a marketing team because it was a culture, internal culture. This is like probably when my career actually has a changing point and I start to figure out this kind of design, culture, behavior kind of elements, although I didn't realize at the time. But I joined a marketing team. They were looking for someone who could help change their culture behaviors to align better with their external brand that
And
they were promising.
this
Was
was
it
Tourism Holdings.
Tourism Holdings? Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm jumping ahead probably, but I was like,
No,
this
you're
is
doing
where
great. Like, so tell me about joining this. So, when you interviewed for it, you were like, yes, this makes total sense. And they looked at you and said, yes, this makes total sense. Or was there a little
I
bit of
wore jeans.
tea
And
or
as I was walking up, I wore jeans to the interview. And on the day, I remember I had like, my old suits and I had my pair of jeans. And I was like, I'm going to wear my jeans. And I was like, this is what you said, Chloe. Walked up the stairs and my soon to be manager said, I love that you're wearing jeans. And I was like, yes, this is my place. And she had never hired a role like this before. And I just spoke to her and I said, well, this is culture. Like, from what I know, culture more sits in HR. And she's like, yeah, but the challenges at that time with HR, not necessarily focusing on culture at the time, even though now it seems so strange. HR was admin and policy driven. She said, I want someone who understands people, wants to help us change the culture, and gets kind of what I'm trying to do. And I was like, sign me up, I'll give it a go. So I actually joined the marketing team, and then over the course of the time, I turned more into an OD role, which is now what you know as an organizational development role. You're looking at the culture, and you're like, well, you can't really look at culture in isolation. You have to look at the behaviors, and then you have to look at then the leadership, and then you look at the structure, and then you look at kind of what the whole design of the organization. So it sort of grew into that type of role, which is, again, I didn't know it was OD at the time. Sort of fell into it, and you just find yourself doing jobs and you're like, oh, that's right, it was an OD role in the end.
yes, so you label it afterwards.
Afterwards, you're like, hindsight is great.
As
Yeah.
hindsight, it was OD. Tell me what this is. So, what does the day look like in this period as you're like coming to, a lot of people have aspire to culture like roles, but have no idea what you would do as a steward of culture. So what are you sort of showing up and doing at Tourism Holdings?
Yeah, so I would show up. I did internal comms as well, which is actually such a critical part of culture in terms of like, if you think about like one of the artifacts is getting the comms right. And sometimes internal comms isn't necessary. I don't know where it should go, but I was doing internal comms, and because I had a marketing person to guide me, the language was pretty well crafted and it was really thoughtful. And it was like, I had a marketing person to say, well, no, run it almost like a campaign. And I was like, okay, that's really interesting, rather than just like shoot out a bunch of stuff. And I started learning about, okay, comms and attention. So I would do some comms in terms of what was happening, and it was paying attention to some of the CEO is very deliberate in what he was trying to achieve as well. And he was bringing in design thinking at the same time. And he was quite specific, and I want to have people thinking more creatively and outside of the box. And so and trying to challenge their ways of thinking in terms of not just doing stuff like they always have done. So every comms that would come out, I'd try to think of ways to sort of put that in. And then the other part was, say, looking at leadership. So thinking about designing a leadership program that would help leaders. And some like examples of projects I'd run, we'd have 360s, which, if anyone who doesn't know, it's where you get feedback from your peers, your manager, your direct reports, and yourself. At the time, 360s were almost like the train wreck of feedback. So you would get like the score and you'd be like, you got a 2.3 from your peers. You are now a 2.3 when you should be a 4. And I remember looking at this going, this is horrific. Like, what are you supposed to do? What is so much? And they
What
just
is
got
the
me to coach them.
2.3?
I was like, I don't even, and they would say, well, can you coach the leaders who have got this feedback? And I was like, I can't coach to that. I don't, it's got nothing in it. And it's not right. So I said, can you let me redesign the entire feedback process? And so I would pull things apart that had been done was mostly what I would do. So and I think a lot of OD is that you've always got to be challenging what's been done. And I would look at something and be like, okay, can I make it any better? Um, and I just redesigned feedback and made it much more. I did a bucketed approach. So I said, okay, well, give me here's a list of options. Tell me what of these things fit in my strengths and tell me what of these things fit in my opportunities.
Mm.
And I don't need a score. You just need to know, okay, these are some things I need to work on. These are some things I'm good at. And you can coach to that and people can do something with that feedback. So you couldn't rank the leaders on that data, but I said to the leadership team, I was like, what's more important, like developing leaders or getting a ranking that you can use? And they were like, oh, probably the first one. So designing,
I like 2011 Chloe. She's spunky. She's
it was great.
truth
I
to
was
power.
way overconfident. It's like,
That you might be unsurprised to find that's another theme that we see here on the power
yeah,
side is that, there might be a streak because you have to. I mean, there has to be a little bit of sort of foolish idealism in those early days,
there is. And
especially when there's no paths.
there's no path. And there's like, I don't know what the right answer is, but I know this isn't how it should be done. At least let me have a go trying to figure out a different way. And then, you realize, oh, there's limitations, but that's the kind of stuff I would do. So I would, and I think OD, I mean, that's like your day to day. And then some of it was culture programs. You were helping like teams have proper conversations. And proper conversations, I mean, rather than just getting together as a team and saying, okay, what's on today, like a stand up, which is important. You would say, look at, okay, what are the overall goals of the team? How do you talk about challenges? So now what you call team building then was like, let's go out for cake and ice cream. And that's team building. I was like, no, team building is actually understanding what people bring and having these more
Psychological safety and the things that
exactly.
we now have names for lots of these things that at the
You
time.
bet you didn't know what it was. So it was something called like drive time because we were a camper van company. Drive was like drive time. So you would get the teams together for drive time. And they would move away from the day-to-day task and they would talk about topics that we'd often prompt them with topics. So they didn't have to come up with them themselves and you'd give them a few questions or exercises to do. And it was like 10 or 15 minutes. And then I would go around and help the different teams kind of have these sort of discussions. So facilitate, and then I'd facilitate leadership groups around these discussions using kind of a similar format. So this is where sort of facilitation comes in, like how do you get a group.
Yeah, so I'm hearing really three things, right? One of the things is you had an own channel, right? I think it is very important somewhere in your career, particularly early in your career, to own something and be able to have that, not just advisory, but, have some control over the ability. So there's sort of this, ownership piece of comms. There's sort of this advisory piece in terms of facilitation on teams, facilitation with leaders. And then there's this sort of contrarian systems piece that is like, I don't know what the right answer is, but I know whatever we're doing isn't right, which I love. I mean, I think there's this tendency sometimes to sort of say, well, you shouldn't question something unless you have a better answer. And I'm like, no, questioning is the beginning of how you find a better answer. Like the beginning of the scientific process is to recognize something as suboptimal, right? You have to identify like, that's really fucking painful. And then we're going to find like, I don't know the
and
answer.
then you figure it out. Yeah. And that's, I mean, much later on, that's what I do at Culture Amp is you go, this is a problem. I don't know how to solve it, but let's figure it out. And at the time it was challenging. And when you would be in front of an executive team and you would say, the 360 leadership process is really not working. I've got some ideas that may or may not work. Can I have complete control over redoing it?
And your CEO was like, yes, you can.
He was like, yes, you can. So I was incredibly lucky that he did let me redo a lot of things. And, it was great. I got some good feedback where he would, I ran like a couple of leadership sessions where he was like, didn't quite hit the mark. I was like, okay.
Well, you highlight another important thing, which there is a resilience to being, because, if everything works, it's not science. There has to be failures. There has to be the ability to try a pilot and go, yep, nope, nope.
That didn't work. And it's like, I'm laughing about it now, but at the time it's pretty devastating. You're so upset. You're just, I was in my 20s. I was confident and then I'd get knocked down but it's
But
all
I
part
got
of
up
it.
again and
I
never.
got need a song.
See, era appropriate music as we're talking about 2011. So you were there for sort of 3-ish years.
3 years, yeah.
And then what made you go, hey, I'm ready for the next thing?
Well, two things. So one is my role, it got bigger. It kind of grown. The company was, I think, close to 2,000 people. And I created myself essentially an OD role. So me, an OD, late 20s, an OD role at a 2,000 person company with no other support. I was like, this is a huge role. And I had run out of, I guess, energy to ask for more resources and didn't really know how to go about it either. I didn't know how to ask for a raise, all these things you know so much about. And then the best option for me was to leave because I didn't know how to do these things.
What a sad. I mean, obviously you've gone on to a great and brilliant career, and I'm glad that you left so you could do these other things. But it is a sad thing that, like, sometimes women get forced out of organizations simply because they're like, I don't even, your CEO probably would have said yes to more
He probably would
resources,
have,
but I didn't
he's
even.
amazing. He probably would have said yes and helped me get to work, but I didn't know how to ask. I didn't know how to bring it up. I didn't know how to say, I think I deserve this or those things. So that was one thing. I guess there's three things. Then the other thing was we were looking at data and particularly on engagement surveys. And I realized I was like, okay, I'm up in one company. I quite like the idea of looking across multiple companies, and can I do that in some way? And then the third thing was my mum actually got really sick, and I wanted to be able to spend more time with her. So I kind of quit my job, and my brother at the same time quit his job, and we were both in Melbourne at the time. And we were like, all right, well, I was like, I'll do my own thing. We'll figure the rest out later. Let's kind of see if we can make this work to create more time to go back to New Zealand and see my mum. So it was sort of like a combination of things at that time. All worked out for the best, actually. So,
But all very important. I mean, I think one of the things that comes up, when you have a kid or something happens to your family, you need to
priorities change.
yeah, you got to reconfigure
Yeah.
some of these things. That sometimes white men don't necessarily have to change their careers in quite the same way because we don't, play the same role in those things, unfortunately. And I do think that they can be big changes. If you could speak to younger Chloe about asking for resources and like, how would you advise someone who is your younger self and is grown into this role at a 2,000 person company? Is a lot of people to be trying to do these OD programmatic things at. Do you think you would have stayed even if you had more resources, or do you think that itch of like, I might want to do this beyond more than one company
I think, to be honest, the doing it beyond more company
continue
would have pulled
eventually
me
pushed you out?
eventually. Like I may have stayed another 6 months or another year or so, but I think I eventually would have been pulled to that
And there is
type
that
of
sort
work.
of trajectory for you, right? You're sort of starting very hyper local individual
Yeah.
coaching of jobless people, like and then, with every role and with every year, you're kind of blossoming into sort of more structural, more structural, more structural.
Yeah.
How'd you get hooked up with the Yahoos at Culture Amp, right?
Culture. Well,
Also,
so I started doing like my own thing, which is I think also like code for like I have to figure it out. But I had a bunch of people that had left THL that asked me to come and work for them and said, "Oh, would you mind, like, you did a great job with this. Do you mind doing some consulting for us?" So I had enough work to kind of live by. My brother had learned how to code. So he's a data scientist slash machine learning engineer slash developer, a pretty handy
got a lot of
slash product
slashes in there,
manager.
man. I like
He's a
this.
lot of like pretty smart techie kind of guy. He was teaching himself to code, and he had done a leadership course, and he had actually done a fitness training program and had given him an app that sent him all these reminders about what to do. And I'd spoken to him about my leadership courses. And again, this is so common knowledge now, but at the time, you would run a leadership course, you'd get all this knowledge in a week, and then you would go home and nothing would happen. And he's like, what if we like help change behaviors using little reminders and little kind of tiny bits of, into behavioral science. He's like, my coach, my behavioral science, he didn't call it behavior, but he's like, my fitness app does this really well. And so I was like, oh, let's have a look. So we bought something called Leadermatic, which we actually came up with the name when we had a few drinks out at dinner. We were like singing Grease Lightning, and we're like, it's systematic, it's hydromatic, it's
It's
leadermatic.
Leadomatic.
So our first product was like a coaching app for leadership. So I'd run leadership programs, And then they would sign up to Leadermatic and they'd get kind of ongoing coaching, and some of the material fed to them. And it was a way just to keep the stuff fresh. We didn't know anything about building a tech company, but we were working out of some of the co-working spaces. And my brother came home one day and said, "Hey, Chloe, there's a couple of guys upstairs who are several guys upstairs. It was the 4 founders, all male anyway." And he said they're doing something in that culture space that you kind of like. And I was like, okay. And he said, they've also got a Series A funding. And I was like, what does Series A funding mean? He's like, it means they've got a product that's probably got legs. And I was like, okay, I will have a look.
It's not called Leadomatic.
It's not called Leadomatic, exactly. And I was like, more than we have legs? And he's like, a lot more. And I was like, okay, I'll go have a look. So I got introduced to Dr. Jason McPherson, who was the chief scientist at the time and founding scientist of Culture Ramp. And we had a chat on my birthday, and he said, "What are you doing?" I was like, I'm doing my own thing. I've got a couple of days free. And he said, "Can you come and help me out with this project that he was working on?" It was actually called Insights to Action. So one of the challenges they were struggling with is HR were getting these survey results, getting fantastic insights, and then they weren't doing anything about it. So no behavior change was happening. No action is what we called it. So we started looking into that problem. And I was there for, I think, 2 weeks on a contract. And then the CEO asked me how long I was staying for. And I was like, "I don't think I'm going anywhere." And he's like, "Good." So
Good. That's fine.
that was pretty much it.
Nice hiring interview, Chloe.
It was great hiring.
Yeah, I started and then I just never left.
It was exactly. It was kind of that. I mean, back in the day, Culture Ramp were 15 people. So it was early enough that you could just keep hanging around and people were happy to have you stay.
And they still are after 9
They
years. Still very happy to have you stay. Talk to me a little bit about how your role emerged, and because we get a lot of people asking about sort of like early stage roles and how do you evolve this and how do you keep going and stay relevant and sort of carve out the right niche for yourself here. Talk to me about the trajectory at Culture Amp. What were you doing in those early days?
Yeah, I think that during the early days of a startup, anyone who's interested, it's very much, I think, about being kind of very flexible and really find out what needs to be done and being able to kind of prioritize ruthlessly with where you put your efforts, and also not minding being spread across multiple things. So I was like the internal L&D person. I did a bit of marketing. I was the customer people scientist who worked with our customers, and I did a bit of product. So in a typical org, I was across like 3 main domains, but it was so small. And I was like, I can do a bit of this, I can do a bit of that. I wasn't great at sales. So I didn't do any sales, and I couldn't build products. I didn't do any kind of like tech stuff. And so I started doing that. And then we needed to open an office in London. So I moved over to London and helped set up the office there. And so I grew the team there with a colleague from, I think there were 5 of us to start. And when it got to about 20, I was like, all right, I think my job is done. And so that was one of those, I had the flexibility in my life at the time that I could take that leap and just move to London within the space of a couple of months and, help set up an office. But I think learning those skills were pretty helpful. But I was still working very much on the customer side, and I enjoyed it. I like customer work. I did hospitality all throughout my time. So I was like, this feels good, but I had missed being in touch with the product. And so after about 2 years in London, I spoke to Dr. Jace, who was my mentor at the time. And I said, I'm thinking about coming back to Melbourne. I'd like to be more involved in product. And he said, yep, come over. I'm building the data science team. We're starting to do something more in the like kind of scientific method. Come over and hang out with us. So I came back and joined Jace. And we then had a few years of working directly with the product teams, doing research. We were using natural language processing models to build out our text analytics. And so that was happening with what the data scientists were doing. And we were sort of consulting to the product teams on, it was kind of a, let's figure out how to do this. So I did that for, probably like a good couple of years. We worked on various products. And then I noticed that we would do research into certain topics more opportunistically. Like Jace would come up with a great idea. He'd spend his weekend, crunching some numbers, doing some research, have some great insights. Marketing would love it. We would publish it. It would get good recognition. We spoke and he's like, I think we need to have a more dedicated type research lab. And so we started something called Culture Lab, which was looking at, research-driven insights from our own data rather than, I guess, academically. So that was I started, I guess, a common theme throughout Culture Amp is seeing like opportunities and be like, oh yes, I think I can do that, or I think I'll give this a go. And so grew Culture Lab was 2 people. It was Jace and a data scientist. Jace retired, and so I took it over. It was me and a data scientist, and then grew it to about 20. And then I was like, all right, this is probably about the size where I'm out of my depth technically, because it was mostly data scientists and it was getting more into data infrastructure.
Mm.
We need to bring in someone with more technical expertise to take over the leadership. And then my kind of main pivot in my kind of career at Culture Amp was to start PSX. So I got new leadership into the Culture Lab. They took over the data center, I guess. And I convinced the founders that we needed something called PSX, which essentially was created, which was called People Science Experience. And so what we need to be doing is looking how we can directly embed in a systematic way people science or psychology and behavioral science into our product. Now, we had always done it, but there hadn't been a team, and it hadn't been done systematically or programmed or using methods that aligned with product. It was more relationship based. So I knew the product managers, I would talk to them, I would work with them on a project, rather than how do we actually embed these principles into how you're building product, which now we know is just a behavioral science methodology that's laid on product methods. But at the time we didn't know, and I didn't know either. I hadn't met you yet. So I was like, what am I doing? I'm just kind of using some kind of sciencey stuff to try get product happening. But started PSX, and that's still growing, but it got to about 10 before I went on maternity leave. So I was doing that for probably the last 2 or 3 years at Culture Amp, and still a work in progress. But that was really bringing in processes that align with product, where you're looking at how can we work with UX researchers, designers, analytics, data scientists, like our research base, to use that to help inform product innovation. And how can we do behavioral psychology or people science, whatever label you want to use, on the testing that UX researchers are already doing. So a lot of the challenges, like you're building a product and product managers and design already have a way of building product. How can you kind of give them a layer of human behavior on top of the process they're already doing, rather than creating something new?
Yeah, I think there is. First of all, we're going to unpack many of those stages. You're like, and now
like
in a 2-minute soliloquy, all of the things. No, we're going to unpack some of these. But yeah, to your point, I mean, I think there's often this somewhat combative role by some people who are like, we got to get in there and blow up everything, blow up their spot. I'm like, no, evolve. I really like the word evolve. We're going to evolve what they're doing, right? Which, suggests that there was something that came before and there's something that will come after, and hopefully will continue to change and continue to improve and continue to be better, but doesn't involve blowing up. I'm putting the finishing touches on this how to build behavioral science teams document, and there's a whole about a page long thing that's like, you don't have to hire all these people net new. Like, you probably have them, you probably just have not arranged them in a sequence that would allow you. I'm fascinated by there's a quote in my book from a British rapper, The Streets, and he has a line, some fuckers get the aces and the high ones, so organize your 2s and 3s into a run and you'll have fucked them some. And I like that. I'm not a big poker player, but I like that about poker, that like the most powerful hand is not actually like high cards. Your most powerful hand is like cards lined up next to each other. And those can be, you can have a 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Like you can have like not great cards, but if you can get them sort of arranged correctly, you can get disproportionate things, which I think is one of the things that you've done really well with PSX, is like, hey, how do we sort of take these components that we already have and get them to work together in a way that is less lossy than, so
and I
much
think
of
it's in a way, it's almost startup mentality where you don't have the money to buy all the resources. You have to kind of work with what you have. And I think in some companies they might go, oh, okay, well, we probably what you're facing. Okay, so we need to hire 6 different roles for all these things. And it's like, no, you can kind of work with what you have. And like, it's more, figuring that out. And I think also going through seeing companies who do these big cultural transformations, I'm like, I personally do not have the energy for some of those huge, big undertakings when I just want to like quickly prove that this can work. So in a way, it's easier to go, okay, tell me what methods you're already using as a product team. These are the steps I think we can kind of embed in, rather than trying to get these people to go through a huge transformation. Because even to get people to do new steps is a big thing. It's like, let's not make it harder for ourselves. And it's always package the unfamiliar familiar. I use that a lot in like, how can I make this sound and seem like something you're kind of already doing?
Yeah, there's a lot of promoting pressure to,
It
yeah, I'm
is.
already doing this, and a lot of reduced inhibiting pressure to, I don't have to learn anything new. Fantastic.
Not too new, and then enough excitement that it feels like and it does make a change. So how do you do that where makes enough of a difference? They're like, okay, this is worth repeating, and so that's like showing the value, and then often that's just like reminding them of the things that were considered earlier on because of these slight tweaks to how you've been doing things.
Yeah, I think that communication part, taking your career all the way back to the beginning, right? I was talking to somebody yesterday who happened to be in town for a conference, and she had a really good idea, and she was just going to do it. She was like, I'm not even going to ask for permission. I'm just going to do it. And I was like, I'm going to tell you to ask for permission, not because you need permission, but because you want people to know what you're doing, right?
It's so
Otherwise,
true.
it will
Yeah.
just succeed and no one will know what happened. Like, you have to sort of, there's a communication element to behavioral science that maybe I think it's hard for some folks, especially if they came from academia. Academia is it's very gauche to sort of toot your own horn in academia, right? It's supposed to be other people toot the horn for you, right? And that doesn't always work in business. I mean, sometimes you have to sort of say, like, hey, this is how we're evolving things, and this is why it was successful. And look, you avoided some mistakes here, and you avoided launching things that didn't work going to work, and you avoided these other things, and that's good. And celebrating that collectively.
And that is hard to do. I had to like write it in as a step so I don't forget to do it like for myself. Because otherwise I got some great coaching in my life once that said, what I do is I do a piece of work and then I kind of hold it up and go, will someone look at this and maybe like it, please? So it was
Yeah.
like, how can you not do that? So again, Ken, what you're saying is communicating what you're doing, reiterating, and not just being like, someone look at my piece of work, maybe.
Do you think that your client experience helped you do that, right? Because clients do sort of need to be, even if they're past sales, they still need to be sold to, right? It needs to feel like a
Oh, well,
success.
we would, yeah, absolutely. And we would also do a lot of like retention of customers. And, when they've already got their product, they were like, how do I get additional value? You knew that there was underneath, like you had to bring value to them. And a lot of it is reminding them of the value you've already brought and talking through what you're doing. And you don't want to be, it's not about boasting. It's just about sometimes highlighting things that have already happened or talking or helping people get new insight, I suppose. But definitely customer world, it's a lot. Customers are really challenging. I think you can find, they help. And I think about customers more generally. I'm a customer. I can be challenging. I have expectations of everyone, that I'm working with. But hospitality was like great training for that early on, like getting yelled at because you gave someone the wrong food and having to like manage those really intense conversations working with chefs. I think all of that has helped me then deal with HR, generally super lovely people. The criticisms are like so nicely packaged. I'm like, this is so easy to like help deal with these, like it's not super emotionally driven. So anyway, I think lots of skills throughout your life can kind of help you, but customer work definitely in terms of, just what we were talking about.
I use the restaurant analogy a lot in, when I talk about this sort of business model, behavior model, operational model, right? Like business model orders what they want, right? They have to tell us what behaviors they care
Yeah.
about. Behavioral model needs to translate that into something we can actually do. And then operational model has to actually build it, right? You need some chefs back there who can actually cook the darn thing, right? So when I take somebody's order, I, in my mind, have to go, hey, can the chefs even cook this with the things that we have? And I think it's an analogy for me, but it also is, an experience that I've had working in hospitality, right? Like you do, the expression of horror on a chef's face at like, I worked so hard to do this and now you're bringing it back is definitely reminiscent of the look of horror from engineers when you're like, I worked so hard to build this.
And now I know.
It's
It's like
that same frozen expression where you're not 100% sure if they might hit you with that meat cleaver.
I once made the mistake of throwing a meal out in front of the chef. Never
Oh,
again. It was awful. I was so stressed. Like I didn't even think about it. And I just went, Like I was like, sorry, I had to bring a meal back. The customer, and I just went like that into the bin. And the minute it was like sliding off the plate, I was like, I'm making the biggest mistake of my
I should not have
hospitality
done that.
life.
I should not have
In
done
this moment, I can't do anything about it. I'd never did that again. And it was like, at least it wasn't an obnoxious movement. It was more just absent-minded, but still. Anyway, so yeah, it's like deleting a whole, you know, month of engineer's work because it wasn't quite what was ordered. Anyway, it's similar things, you know, it's the skills, I think. And I did hospitality, I think, you know, probably 7 or 8 years, probably all up, which is a pretty significant portion of your career if you think about how much time, you know, you
Well,
work.
but you're well trained. Well trained. What what made you say, was it more about lifestyle? Hey, I'm ready to come back from London, and the way to come back to London is go back to Melbourne and do this? Or were you kind of done with client work? Do you think there was a part of you that sort of said, hey, I need to do something different? Tell me a little bit about
Yeah,
that
I think
transition.
again I kept going back to that scale. Like I was working one-on-one with customers and I really enjoyed like solving individual customers and I got a lot of energy in the moment. I was doing lots of talking events. Um, but when I heard what the product folk were doing and they were thinking like, how can we, at the time they was just starting to talk about manager behavior. And I was like, oh, this is my bag. Like I think I want to
Ding!
start this. I was
I
like,
heard
oh,
the
this is
behavior
interesting.
word.
This is me, manager behavior. I was like, oh, and they were talking about some problems. They're like, oh, we can't get our managers to, I think it was like log on to the platform at the time, and we can't get managers to take through take through the team's reports with them. And I was like, oh, like, this is super cool stuff to start to think about. Not just work with one organization and handhold all their managers. It's a different type of personality, I guess, because I enjoyed that to some extent. But I was like, no, I really want to work on this scale problem. And so that was it. And using, I think also I was a little bit done with customer work. I wanted to be more behind the scenes. And that was a good realization to come to, going, actually, I don't mind. Like I'm comfortable facilitating. I don't mind giving talks. I enjoy some of that, but 70 or 80% of my day, I actually want to be a little bit of that person back in the lab, back in the
Going all the
biology.
way.
I want to
I
be
want to go back
full
to
circle, not quite entirely. You can have your cake and eat it. I want to be, behind the scenes, working with data scientists, engineers, behavioral scientists, designing experiments, figuring like doing some of the really deep thinking on a problem rather than that really quick thinking on your feet. And you do need both. And I kind of developed a lot of that quick thinking on my feet. I was like, I want time to really think about a problem and solve it over time with enough space to kind of experiment and think about it. And that's why I created PSX, was we were sort of solving problems, really trying to solve problems really quickly and almost at pace, as if we were customer facing. And I was like, for product, these problems are multi-million dollar problems when you really think about how much money and resources we're going to spend on them. You do not want me thinking about giving you an answer in an hour or even a day. Like some of these problems, we want to go through the process to actually do our research, do our experiments, test our assumptions, all the stuff. Um, how can I create an environment where me and other people can do that type of work and it's somewhat protected? So Jace was very much aligned with me on that. And he said, come back with me and we will create something new. So
we'll do something different and more interesting. I love one of the things you said in there, which was about, hey, I'm good at this and I can do it, but I don't want to be doing it all of the time, which I think is for a lot of people get in a trap of like, well, I just have to do whatever I'm good at. My job has to be whatever I'm good at. And in fact,
yeah.
Most people are good at lots of things, right? Like they're good at more than one thing. You, Chloe, are a rich and diverse individual with lots of talents and skills. You don't always have to be using all of them in every moment to do this thing, because that can be a little bit of a trap at times, I think.
It can be, and it can be exhausting. I think you got to think about where your energy levels are. And for me, I go back to like your work values, but I really like creating things and just, experimenting. But what that meant if I was doing talks is I would be driven to create a new talk, an experiment every single time, which is really stressful because you have to you're doing a talk for the first time every single time because I just wanted to do new things all the time. And it was like paired with that, it wasn't a good combination. But doing new things all the time in experiments is great because you're by yourself, you don't have that social pressure. So it's the same skill, just applied in a different kind of area.
Yeah, and there's it's a lot easier to go up and experiment than a talk. I have,
Yeah.
as someone who does, as you know, a lot of speaking, 99% of the time, I'm an extraordinarily good speaker. 1%, oh, I've gotten very dark. Alexa, desk on. Most of the time I'm a pretty good speaker, but every once in a while I will just die. I just get out there and die, and I can't, and it doesn't work. And that
Yeah.
is okay. But, to your point, every client facing moment, you want to land it, right? Because
You
it
do.
means so much to the business, and you got to win that, you got to win the business. You got to do that. Like, there is a pressure for it to be working 100% of the time. And I don't know that as a scientist, you almost feel like you're forcing it, right? It's hard to sort of be natural
Yeah.
because, you can't have failures in the same way
Yeah.
that,
And then
like,
what was good about the shifted product is then I still like a bit of client, I still like doing talks, I still do them. I still like client facing work, but I would work with clients who were wanting to experiment. So it was very deliberate in who you work with. So I would say, we're in the lab, we're testing this out. Are you willing to come and, learn with us? And they were fantastic customers to work with. So, the
how do you find those I think that's a good, how do you find those customers that are willing to come on the journey? What are the early signs that a customer has that experimentory, I'm willing to go along on you,
Yeah.
how did you get
For
that?
me, it was normally the HR person themselves is trying to break something and
Mm.
they can't quite figure out how to break it. So they're all trying to, sorry, can't figure out how to make it work. So they're like, oh, I've been playing around with how to redo performance reviews, for example. I've been trying to get my managers, I've built like a bunch of templates and I've got 20 managers doing it, but I don't know how to get everybody. And they will chat to our customers and they're already doing those kinds of things. And because our customer people scientists will be talking to them and they normally, yeah, they're like, I read this book. So they're kind of, I guess, curious, open. And it's not the whole organization. Sometimes there are, but normally it's an individual who has scope to experiment within their company. So normally a senior OD person or the chief people officer has that type of mindset. And then they get you on board and you work with them. And normally it is typically, tech companies that are pretty progressive or they want to be seen as progressive in the space. It kind of goes along with it, but not always. It's sometimes an individual in a very traditional organization who just, reminds me a little bit of myself, kind of breaking a 360. So those are the types of people that are pretty good. And also they kind of have a similar attitude of, I know this way isn't working. I don't quite know what the answer is, which is very different from, I know what the answer is. I want you to build something that does this answer, that creates this solution. Like I have a solution, make my solution work. That's not a good fit for me.
AKA me as I remember my first cultural amp discussion where I'm like, just make the system do the thing I want. We've been doing this experiment manually, and I already know it works because we've been doing it manually. I just need you to make it do it automatically. And culture amp was like, no, we don't do that. And I was like, okay, well, fine. But
like, no.
but I know it works because we've been doing it manually but it's
Although that, like I've been doing it manually is, I love that phrase because that is actually a really good signal that we've got something to work with.
100%. Yeah.
And so, because I would have that, like with our manager one product, I was doing it manually. I figured out how to do it manually. And I was literally walking around with pieces of paper with these drawings on that I was getting managers to have these one-on-one conversations using these little drawings. And I was like, these are working. Let's turn it into a product. So I was that person. And then you do that and then you can scale it. But that manually and it's working is, to me, that was also like a good signal, which is like, I've changed our performance review, I've done it, and I just can't get it to like all these people.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point because you're not necessarily saying, hey, they're open to, it's not necessarily openness, right? It's so much as like they've already tried breaking it. Like they're already like in action.
Yeah.
Right.
And I guess what doesn't work from like a product point of view is this is what it should look like in the product, and this is what we want you to build. And that was my humbling experience as an IO psych. Like I had my piece of paper and I was convinced if you just build this exactly how it is, it will work. And then you talk to a designer and they're like, well, that's not how it works in tech. This is not how you do user research. And you're like, oh, that completely falls over when you have a tech. So I think that's the difference when I said like having a solution. It's like, I've got this thing, I kind of know how it might work. I want to like figure it out. And then you go, okay, this is probably not how it's going to look in a product, but let's figure it out. And this is like a base point, and probably the end result is going to be like really different.
Mm-hmm.
But as long as it's solving your problem, then we're somewhere. But the starting point of trying to break something and manually do it because it's so clunky to use any other technology is a good starting point.
I was giving a talk at Warwick recently, and one of the students asked, you keep talking about pilots, what's the difference between a pilot and a prototype? And I was like, pilots will probably look nothing like what it eventually ends up, they're just trying to, is there even a spark of something?
Can we do something with this?
Yeah, it's like, is there even the core psychological things are right? It's not actually, a prototype is much more like an experiment about what it will actually look like. I don't even pretend that my pilots are what they're, I like.
No, you're just like, and sometimes you're only testing like one little piece to be like, I want to see if this kind of thing will work. Like I was trying to see if people would even scribble in how they feel in front of their manager, like it's just like one little behavior that I was trying to test. Because if that doesn't work, then there's no point. I don't know how it's going to look in the product. I didn't even know. I'm just testing this one little bit. And it was like my 10 managers, which is what these early pilots look like. It's literally 10 people. You're like, okay, there's a glimmer of hope here. Let's do the next thing.
Yeah. And that glimmer, I love that you use the word glimmer. It is that little spark, that little glimmer that's like, is there enough evidence? I talk about the difference between academic and applied behavioral science as, the currency of academia is certainty, right?
Yeah.
P less than 0.05, because other people are going to come build on top of it. So you have to be really right.
Yeah.
You don't have to be that right in applied. You just have to be right that the cost benefit ratio, right enough for the cost benefit ratio. If you imagine some error bar, if the error bar crosses over the benefit, then you're like, all right, man, kind of sure. Let's try.
It's kind of gonna go okay. Yeah. I do. I enjoy it a lot more having that approach than like the pure research. And we do both in our practice. We do like research. We have to report, data with certainty and p-values and strength testing. And then we do the applied stuff, which is like, okay, we've spoken to 10 people. There's a glimmer of hope that this is let's do the next kind of iteration.
That's right. And that iterative.
And then you get asked, like, how certain are you? And you were like, I have my own scale of certainty.
Right. Certain enough for the cost benefit ratio. It's really cheap and it might be really good. So I've got a certain enough, right? Like,
yeah, it's like, it's going to be 10 hours and this much, and it's worth doing the next step.
Yeah, let's find out. Let's go to the next level. That iterative piece is really key, right? I think the lovely thing that behavioral science and behavioral scientists like you have brought to the field is it's not the iteration of like, I don't know, the startup canvas or something, right? Where they're like kind of blindly iterating. I'm like, no, there's like theory to it, right? Like it's theoretically bound iteration, right? Like I know why I'm doing the next thing. I'm not just changing a color because I'm changing a color. Like
you've got this theoretical base and you build your like hypotheses on it, and but you're constantly, and so another topic, but I was going to say, so many with the replication crisis in psychology, so many things. I'm like, oh my God, I have to rethink everything. But I still think, no, it just gives me a base that I can test it and go, this is one way. Is this, it kind of makes you more curious. You make much less assumptions as well.
And what's next for you? Continuing to evolve BSX, I think.
So I'm actually just talking about that now. I'm looking at going into in our product. We just recently announced a partnership with Orgnostic, which is a people analytics platform. So it's using kind of back to the roots. It's like giving really good insights from like a data point of view to help inform leaders and managers like what to do. So there's that kind of culture amp. On the side, I'm kind of teaching some of the basics of behavioral science to some startups. I mentor startups on what they should do, and I talk to them about behavioral mapping. I absolutely love that type of work. So it's a bunch of startups, and I'm like, oh, you're so early in your product is so fresh. You've got all the room in the world to bring in these kind of principles. And I get so much, you're smiling, I get so much energy from that, helping bring in these principles like right from the beginning. And some of the startups, when I worry about the world, I see what these startups are doing. I'm like, oh, we're going to be okay. So a bit of that. And then, I coach some like female leaders who want to get into the tech world. And I think I'll continue to do, build more of that space.
Yeah. Keeping your hand in. I think it's that diversity. Well, as you said, you like new things, you like diversity. And so having that diverse slate of things. Thank you so much for coming and chatting with me. I always love talking to you, and it's always so energizing this is 7:00 here on the West Coast. It's always so lovely to just have a little chat with you. And I really appreciate you coming and spending some time with me today.
Thanks, Matt. That was super fun, and no baby crying. So
I was listening.
Very good. That's a win.
But they, you know, I can put babies to sleep. I'm very boring. And so babies are more than happy to, I have a lot of friends who hand me babies because babies just lay on Matt Wallet and go to sleep. I think,
I
adults
wonder if
find
it'll work
me,
if I just like play a recording of your voice at like 5 a.m. when she's awake. I'll try it out.
I mean, if you don't mind a little cursing, you could just put on the audiobook and just lull her to sleep. She might say some words, they might say some words that you're not so keen on later, but, all right. Chloe, you're
Thank
always
you
such a
so much.
treasure. So much fun. Thank you for all the great work that you do at Culture Amp. You know, I think, you know, you've done a really amazing job of bringing, you know, applied behavioral science into the product, you know, and helping them continue to grow. And it's so wonderful to see. And I'm so glad we get to be friends.
Amazing. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah. See you, Chloe. Bye.